Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, I interview Mike J., author of a number of books. Most recently, a book on mescaline. I believe the full title is Mescaline, A History of the First Psychedelic. He's an Englishman, super clever. I loved this book. This is no joke. I've been talking about it somewhat obsessively for a while, and it probably was my favorite 2019 book. Just really stoked on it, and can't recommend it enough. I think I even tell first-timers who haven't even tried psychedelics to just read it because it's a great history and covers a lot of ground that I think is important to understand in terms of American history. In world history, given psychedelics is a global phenomenon. So, I think you're going to really dig this episode, and you're really, really going to dig the book if you like the episode. So, check it out. Book's available all over the place. You can get it on Audible, and you can get it for free on Audible if you sign up for a free trial. I think the URL is audibletrial.com/psychedelics today. You get a free month membership and a free audiobook that you get to keep. It's a trial. Check it out. It helps out the show if you do it that way. Books available all over the place. And, let us know if you like it. It's really fun. And I'm semi-obsessed. I'm probably going to read it a couple more times. So let us know what you think. Psychedelics Today, email@gmail.com. If you want to help us out, here's a few things that will work. So we are launching 2 editions of Navigating Psychedelics for clinicians and therapists starting in February. We've got a European-friendly time and an American East Coast-friendly time, so 7 Eastern and I think it's like 7 UK time. You can learn more about that at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And the cool thing about this course is that it comes with tons of pre-recorded content, and we've got 8 different hour-and-a-half classes together on Zoom. And you get to discuss the content with us. And these are recorded and put into a private class. So if you miss class, you can just check in. You can watch class later. It's okay if you miss class. Also, it is supported by a Slack group where everybody can chat in real time when there's no class meetings. Ask questions of Kyle and I whenever you want, and we'll get back to you. And it's been an amazing process so far. We're expanding from a 5-week to an 8-week program. And 5 weeks is great. It just feels a little short. So we went to 8, and hopefully this is what we settle on. We'll see. It's a phenomenal class, a great value, tons of master classes in there from clinicians talking about their profession. We are going to keep adding master classes, so you'll likely get updates for at least a couple years on master classes for clinicians. So it is a tremendous value. If you want to stay ahead of this curve of psychedelics coming into the clinical space, what better place to start than at home and studying with us? We have talked to all the experts. We know a lot, and we can share a lot. So especially being online, you don't have to fly to California once a month for every 6 months, or hold out to be enrolled in a secret training somewhere for the MDMA trials, or do anything underground. This is fully legal. This class is very legal. We tell you all about your legal options, and we discuss legality and license risk quite a bit. So if you want to know what's legal, what's not, what might put your license at risk and what might not, this is a great class for you. So check it out, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. We would love to have you. And if you can't make it, maybe a friend can. So yeah, that's it for that. So again, psychedeliceducationcenter.com to learn more. You can also just go to psychedelicstoday.com and you'll find it. So another way you can help us, just tell a friend. If you like this episode, share it. That's the nicest, most flattering thing we could imagine. So thank you for doing that if you do it. And also you can support us on Patreon with a small monthly donation. You get access to interviews ahead of time and other special perks. So patreon.com/psychedelics today. That's it for the intro. We will see you on the other side. Hope you enjoy this one. Joe Moore. See you there. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Mike J., author of the recent book, Mescaline. Was there a subtitle to that at all?
Yeah, that is subtitled A Global History of the First Psychedelic.
It was a awesome book. I was very excited the whole way through. I think I was traveling like multiple flights, so that was my companion the whole time, and it was so great. Before we get into that, maybe can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in mescaline as a topic?
Sure. I'm a freelance writer. I've written quite a lot of books. I write quite a lot about the history and culture of psychoactive drugs generally. I'm kind of always drawn to, those about like where did these drugs come from? Who were the first people to take them? How did they kind of find their way into our culture? And so I've been interested in mescaline for a long time. There are like episodes in its history that I've written about before, but nobody had really kind of pulled together the whole story. And it's kind of it's a fascinating story because it's like the kind of prehistory of psychedelia. It's what psychedelics were before there was like this category psychedelic, this pigeonhole to drop them in, and it ranges across so much different territory. Science and art and literature and anthropology and everything else, and so many different languages as well. Like a whole load of the literature is in French or German or Romanian or Polish or Spanish. That it's kind of was a hard story to put together, but I've been kind of, nibbling away at different bits of it for a long time, and then got the chance to kind of, do this big sort of history of that sort of narrative history.
Yeah, it was fantastic. We talk often about mescaline on the show in as much as it's kind of low rank on the totem pole of use, at least. And it's really interesting to see, how long the West has been investigating this. Also, to get a little better understanding of how Native Americans were using peyote way back, and also San Pedro, which is, a little different but similar in a bit. But yeah, it's really interesting to understand like that one episode in the book about this like really early pioneer researcher kind of going out to the American West and doing all this really highly fringe research that it didn't seem like people liked him going on about that. Like, what do you recall that character's name? The early American.
Yeah, is it James Mooney you're talking about?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, he's kind of a really crucial figure, I think, in that transmission from kind of centuries of indigenous use of peyote to it becoming something that the modern world and Western science was interested in. And he's around mostly in Oklahoma in the sort of 1890, around the time of the ghost dance. And it's so strange reading his accounts of that, because at that time, the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the missionaries, they're all really committed to a policy of what they call assimilation of Indians, as they call them, i.e., in the next generation, there aren't going to be any Indians. We're going to send the kids all off to school and teach them English, and, so all those anthropologists at that time were, they were just scrabbling around to, just capture centuries of tradition and ritual and songs and ceremonies before they were all wiped out. And almost nobody else in that generation was interested in peyote, because it was something that most Native American tribes had never done traditionally. They'd never encountered it unless they'd been down to Mexico. And so a lot of the anthropologists went, oh, this is just one of those things that they've adopted on the reservations, like alcohol. It's not really a serious tradition. We shouldn't really look at it. But James Mooney was like, no, hang on. If we're, this is the way that Native American culture is going to survive.
Right. And that that dichotomy almost of assimilation versus let's keep these things a little bit alive. Like, we don't really all want to see American Indians just assimilated and gone essentially from the planet. We would actually like to see standalone cultures, which is kind of in contrast with this manifest destiny idea of no, it's all America. And
yeah, very much that. And it's only kind of like a generation or two later, in the 1930s, with Roosevelt and the New Deal, that there's kind of an Indian New Deal. And part of that New Deal is, okay, Indian religions and customs and religious traditions to be respected, and that was really, I think peyote was pretty central to that, the formation of the Native American church, to protect it under the First Amendment and the freedom of worship. But the guy who was Roosevelt's Indian commissioner, John Collier, kind of comes into this story in this really kind of gonzo episode up in New York in 1916, when he's kind of summoned as a sort of progressive lawyer and friend of Bohemians to deal with the aftermath of this kind of peyote sort of ceremony stroke salon in Greenwich Village that goes horribly, horribly wrong. It's kind of as a result of that he moves from New York down to Taos, and in New Mexico, then he kind of encounters, living Native American cultures for the first time, and, preserving their culture becomes his life goal.
It's really a fascinating episode in the book. I want people to understand this is not a commercial for the book. I was just very excited about it. I talked to everybody about the book, including my parents quite a bit. And it was very cool. Was there a particular episode that fascinated you the most in Mescaline history?
Yeah, I mean, the one we've just been talking about is kind of really fascinating, because that period, the 1890s, it's kind of like the Wild West, but it's also kind of, once you're on the East Coast, it's the fin de siècle, it's the modern world, it's the electric age, and I'd never, I always find it hard to think of those two things happening at the same time. Like Oscar Wilde, goes to the Wild West, which happened. And just a way of telling that story, the best way I've ever found is, this guy, James Mooney, who we've been talking about. Quanah Parker, who is the chief of the Comanches at this point, gives him a big burlap sack full of dried peyote, and he physically takes it back to Washington, D.C., and that's the beginning of, scientific experiments with psychedelics. So it yokes those two worlds together. But then there's a whole fascinating episode, like in the 1920s and 1930s, when mescaline first is synthesized in the laboratory, and particularly in Europe, it's used really widely in scientific experiments. And also there are a lot of scientists who trying to get at what the whole experience means, who give it to artists, to writers, to philosophers. So there's all this amazing art and all these kind of extraordinary, decades before the 60s, and when we think of the psychedelic culture as beginning, there's a whole kind of world of it there.
Yeah, which is really cool to see, and the way they argued about its validity as at least a valid interest point, and avenue of research was super interesting too. I liked how kind of raw it was, and them using that kind of early scientific language was also kind of fun.
It's great fun, I think, and also the other thing that's so different is that at that time it was obvious that if you were interested in psychoactive drugs, then how you started your investigation was by taking them yourself. So all these scientists from that period start off by taking their peyote or injecting themselves with mescaline. And, it's kind of obvious if you're interested in the, sort of how these drugs influence your subjectivity. You can't tell that just by kind of injecting rats with it. The scientists got to be there right in the middle. So in many ways, I find the science of that era much, much more progressive than today. Today's science is very much about taking the subjectivity out of it, trying to kind of reduce it down to sort of brain imaging and data sets, so it's kind of really refreshing to be kind of back in that kind of old school scientific world where, hey, if you're an experimenter, you're a self-experimenter.
Yeah. I was actually thinking about that kind of recently while on some substances. Don't recall which one, but I was thinking just how I'm able to reflect directly on certain things in a way that perhaps a psychedelic naive psychologist or researcher just can't really touch or relate to. Maybe from hearing enough stories, they kind of get it, but really firsthand is quite important. Maybe not everybody needs to do it, but perhaps you should at least have a couple people on your team who aren't psychedelic naive to help shape this research a little bit more.
Yeah.
Or figure out an approved way to do some self-study that would be scientifically meaningful at some point. That would be clever. So did you have a chance while writing the book to try peyote or San Pedro?
Yes, I did. I mean, I had been working with San Pedro for many years. I have down in Peru, but also here. That was the bulk of my mescaline experience. Peyote is kind of a little hard to find an ethical source of it. I was somewhat familiar with that, but until I started the book, I was not familiar with, the chemical compound, the pure mescaline salt. And I'd always had the thing with the cactus that, as it starts to come on, it has all its many and marvelous effects, but they're always accompanied by kind of a heavy body load, usually some nausea, in a way, it's euphoric as well. It's this kind of warm, tingly, full feeling, but there's always a kind of unpleasantness. And I'd always kind of thought, well, I guess that's just the cactus material that I'm having to get down, So it was then interesting to take the pure compound, and as soon as it comes up, it's like, oh, okay, so that is part of the mescaline itself.
There's that scene in Fear and Loathing that I think you mentioned, the Fear and Loathing scene in the book, where is it Benicio del Toro starts like vomiting at one point, and it seems like it's from the mescaline?
Yeah, I think I think what had happened by that point, by 1970, I guess, Thompson is writing that. By that point, mescaline was kind of this legendary substance. Of course, everybody had heard of it because of Aldous Huxley and Doors of Perception, but it was pretty hard to find on the street unless you happen to know an underground chemist who was making like a little batch for connoisseurs. The market had pretty much entirely moved to LSD, and most of the things that you bought on the street, pills or powders called mescaline, were, well, who knows what they were. So
right, this point on microdots that you made in the book was really clever. Yeah. Like, it's not, microdots weren't large enough to contain an active dose of mescaline, really. And so people were probably taking something else at that point.
Yeah, certainly. If it's a microdot or a blotter.
Yeah, I thought that was a really important thing you raised, honestly, because people are probably still buying that on the street, and they're quite misinformed.
Yeah, no, I think these days quite often things get sold as mescaline, which are probably one of Shulgin's phenethylamines, one of mescaline analogs, things like 2-CT7 or whatever. It's kind of a shorthand, but it's not the real deal. So I think in a way, Hunter S. Thompson's use of it in Fear and Loathing, he's kind of, at that point, the protagonists in his book are already on, acid and coke and ether and tequila and everything you can imagine. And he kind of wants at that point to sort of ramp it up and to this peak of psychedelic craziness. And so he goes, and then we pulled out the mescaline, and I think that's like the thing that you could say at that point that, most people couldn't contradict you, everybody had heard of it.
That's a great point.
But nobody had done it, and then actually, you don't really hear much about the mescaline trip. After that, I mean, all the psychedelic craziness just spools on in the. And that there's an earlier essay by Thompson where he talks about his first mescaline trip, which is kind of, he talks about it a bit more directly, but that's kind of odd as well. He says he's got this spansul of mescaline cut with some sort of speed, and you think, well, really, in the late 60s, when mescaline's this kind of really rare and precious substance, you're going to cut it randomly with some amphetamines. So, it's I spent a lot of time on the Erowid site. They have a complete set of this bulletin that the DEA produced called, which is I can't remember what it's called now, but it's a bulletin of kind of all the street drug seizures all the way through the 60s and 70s, and they're kind of looking for mescaline, and they've got the synthesis kind of recorded there. but there aren't any actual mescaline seizures, So I think that was the thing about the 60s, is it was there kind of, as a concept, and as a something that would kind of sort of, would provoke and visions and expectations, but it was probably kind of physically absent for most people at that time.
So you said you had kind of a history of writing about mescaline before. What kind of stuff were you writing? Essays or kind of short pieces?
Yeah, I wrote a book about 20 years ago called Emperors of Dreams, which was about drugs in the 19th century. I was kind of looking at how they sort of entered Western culture. So I wrote a bit then about, how the peyote cactus made its way into sort of Western science, and the first kind of trips with that, in Britain and America and elsewhere. And I've done I did a big survey called High Society, which is a kind of big illustrated history of kind of drugs in culture, which was based on an exhibition I did here in London. And I used some of the great James Mooney photos from the Smithsonian archive of the Kiowa and Comanche peyote ceremonies. So yeah, I'd been aware of that material and always kind of nibbling away and, getting to the edge of, running off the edge of my skill set and my language base, so I kind of got to that point where I, wanted to push that all forward and, get the whole story working.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Great. Glad to hear you've been writing about this stuff for a long time. When I saw your book, my first thought was, who is this guy, and why is this book getting such a big, spot in the spotlight from a lot of folks, and very earned. But it was just kind of interesting. Yeah. Who is Mike J? He's been a writer on this stuff for a long time. Are you primarily a writer?
Yeah, I'm primarily a writer, so books and journalism. I also curate stuff and write, whatever. I've kind of, the sort of history of drugs has become my kind of specialist subject. I think I got into it at a good time when kind of academics weren't really writing about it, because it wasn't like a cool thing to say at academic cocktail parties. So I'm writing about the history of drugs. It's kind of a bit of a dirty subject, and but it was just full of amazing stories. So it kind of became a patch that I worked on. But really, kind of, there's a lot of that is about opiates and cocaine and cannabis or hashish. Kind of psychedelics is a smaller part of the story until recently. But picking mescaline as a topic was a way of threading all those great early stories together.
Yeah, I begrudgingly started reading Ayat Walban's book on microdosing, and it was interesting for her to cover the drug war stuff and the use of laudanum by tons of people, alcohol mixed with opium. So it was just a high society drug, or just everybody was using this drug. So like the degree to which opium has been in the culture has been amazing.
Yeah, and we have, I think the image that we have of opium now is very much drawn from Thomas de Quincey, this idea that it's something oriental and exotic and dark and dangerous and fascinating. But, it was basically something that was in everybody's, kitchen or bathroom cupboard. It was in the days before, paracetamol and ibuprofen and everything else. It was the basic go-to painkiller. It was pretty prosaic. And, if we hadn't discovered those other drugs, I guess we'd probably still be using it now.
Right. We don't have to get into him too much, but Aleister Crowley, like the main dismissal of him as a person is that he died a heroin addict, but people don't even understand the degree to which opium was used as a prescription drug back then. We have to really get that, and non-prescription, like nearly recreational drug. So and
by that time there was a thing called the British system. It was okay over here for doctors to prescribe heroin to dependent users, whereas in the States that was kind of you could be arrested as accessory to a crime as a doctor doing that.
Really, that's wild. And the British system apparently was a lot more compassionate. Wow. Because you can't really die unless you're mixing it with alcohol or you take too big of a dose. So what's the big deal? Unless it gets out of control.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of and so many of the harms associated with it are prohibition related. Actually somebody with a clean medical supply of opiates, I reckon any doctor would say you'd rather see somebody like that than somebody who's been drinking heavily for the equivalent period of time.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, mescaline is such a different psychedelic. Like I personally haven't tried San Pedro, mescaline, or peyote, so I don't have a taste of it. I've tried 2CB a few times, and I've loved it, but I understand it's substantially different from the mescaline experience, even though it's kind of related in a sense.
I think 2CB is, as I suggest in the book, once kind of Shulgin came along and made all those synthetic phenethylamines, he kind of designed mescaline out of the pharmacopoeia in a way. 2CB is not unlike mescaline, but it lasts 3 or 4 hours instead of 12. It's not so physically difficult to kind of, it's not so demanding as mescaline, which kind of steamrollers you for, a very long period of time. I think they're different from the tryptamines, sort of LSD, psilocybin, DMT. Mescaline is a phenethylamine, so it's a different type of compound. It doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier so easily, so we need larger doses. It's the same with MDMA and other phenethylamine. That's why you don't get MDMA in microdots or blotters, in a decent chunky pill. And it's the same with mescaline. You need about 300 or 400 milligrams. And so with that comes, a lot more body load, a lot more kind of adrenaline-like responses. But also, I think more of a kind of, and you recognize this from MDMA, it's more of a sort of body and mind drug rather than just a mind drug. The tryptamines, LSD and psilocybin often, are sort of mentally, cerebrally, incredibly stimulating, but your body kind of gets left behind. Mescaline is a bit more like what it's doing to your mind, it's also doing to your body. You kind of, sit there kind of just radiating that energy. So I think, it's in some ways it's much easier to handle for that reason. It's more euphoric, it's more kind of intrinsically pleasant. In other ways, you're dealing with a more intensely physical trip that for some people is uncomfortable.
I will admit that the first time I tried 2CB, I did throw up for a good 2 hours. So I don't know what that was about, but second, third time, no problem. But I was like, is this a mescaline thing? What's going on? I had a great time regardless, so don't know.
Yeah, that's right. No, I mean, there's a body load to take on with all these things, MDMA as well, particularly when you're sort of coming up. A lot of people have kind of sort of a difficult, wobbly moment at that point, and then usually once it's through the blood-brain barrier and into the system, that kind of recedes.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned a thing about the body, which is interesting to me. We often talk about this on our show, that, sometimes psychedelics don't hit these body things that are, we come often from a therapeutic angle, even though that's not my main use case, but we talk about it a lot that way. And often there's kind of residual stuff that the psychedelics don't hit. And we talk about holotropic breathwork as being kind of like a non-drug but similar approach to be hitting these corners where the body material, quote unquote, is stuck. And it's an interesting thing. So we always consider it a way to round out your healing, not necessarily like the only tool, but it's cool to hear you say that about tryptamines that way.
Yeah. And I think this was also accentuated by, when they started being used as research tools in science in the 50s and 60s. people were really interested in the cerebral effects, their mental effects, the hallucinations, all that kind of stuff. And so everything else got then conceived as like a side effect. And I think that's why LSD took over from mescaline in scientific research, because it was active in this tiny dose. So it really looked like it was hitting this specific kind of target in the brain. So obviously that was what you were looking for as a neuroscientist. And then all this other stuff became like residual effects that you're trying to get rid of. Whereas I think there is another way of looking at this experience that, and it's certainly, I think, closer to the indigenous take on it, that, this is not like something that has kind of mental fireworks and unwanted physical side effects. This is something that has a personality with many facets, and these are all part of the experience. They're all part of what it does.
Now, did you have a chance to meet with some traditional users? So like people in the Native American church?
Yes, I did. I got very interested in trying to figure out how the Plains Peyote rite had started, because it seems to start kind of in the 1880s. We assume it goes on back forever, but it's actually almost like a new religious movement. So, there is like a real recorded history, and it's a disputed history. But one of the, tribes who were always seen as the early adopters of it are the Comanches. And Quanah Parker, particularly the chief of the Comanche, was a great ambassador for it and a great champion of it. And the Comanches at that point were in this reservation in southwest Oklahoma in the sort of Huichol Mountains, together with some Kiowa and Apache groups. So I kind of figured out that this was, the center of the story was somewhere around there. And I was then kind of notified about a group of Comanche history keepers who had loads of archives and material from that period. And I kind of emailed them, which is all I could do really, being in London. I realized that, it's a very Native American thing not to have like a shop window on the world, So I kind of emailed them, hopefully, and then they emailed back and said, yeah, we do have a lot of stuff from this period, but this is basically the history of our people. We don't really share it very much. And I said, oh, okay, that's cool. And then a couple of weeks later, they kind of emailed back and went, okay, we've looked you up on Google and YouTube, and, we think you're culturally sensitive. So I started this kind of dialogue, and then went to hang out with them in Oklahoma. They turned out to be awesome, just amazing people with an extraordinary understanding of that period of their people's history. Great glass plate negative photographs where they could identify everybody and tell you exactly what everybody's feather was doing and what it meant. And actually a big collection of eagle feathers that they could go back to the 19th century and say, okay, this one was used in this ceremony at that time, and they invited me. I was there. I could timed my trip for the 99th anniversary of the founding of the Native American Church, where they and a lot of other groups across Oklahoma had meetings on that night. So I got to sit and pray with them, which was awesome.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Was it inside a teepee? From what I understand, there's a very particular ritual Native American church practices. But
yeah, it's very. It was inside a teepee. It's always inside a teepee. I think it originated inside a teepee because this was at the time after the ghost dance, where singing and dancing on the reservation were all banned. So it was kind of a clandestine ceremony. There are lots and lots of, everybody's got their own variation on the ceremony. These guys were very old school. They were very unusual in that, Quanah Parker never converted to Christianity. A lot of Comanches did, like most Native Americans did. So, and these guys were very much kind of in his lineage, so they were kind of fully heathen, So I think you could go to Native American church ceremonies where everybody dresses in their Sunday best, and it's kind of quite like a church service. So they, Yeah, and they also kind of were very, very keen to recreate it very much as it was, sort of back in the day. So whereas other groups, like Navajo groups, for example, are much more syncretic and they're much more creative and they bring in this and that. And, if you go to Navajo ceremonies these days, apparently, there's all kinds of everything from, crystal healing to sort of Pentecostal stuff going on. The experience I had was from a group of people who were very, very solidly committed to holding the line, holding the tradition, holding to the old way.
Right. And I think perhaps it's important to maybe detail this kind of religious repression way back and forced conversion almost. Was it forced conversion to Christianity in a lot of cases, or how did that play out?
Yeah, well, it was, the assumption when the Plains Peyote rites started was that this was something that was savage and backwards and superstitious and something that had to be got rid of before Indians could be Christianized and civilized. And so people like James Mooney was kind of a voice in the wilderness when he was saying, this is not an enemy of Christianity. This is like a unique fusion. This is something that's going to really strengthen, the Indian culture. It's surrounded by this white majority world. But they were saying, he was saying that against the background of times when, kids were being taken off to school, punished in these schools for speaking a word of their own language, and it was really, the 1930s before all the kind of anti-peyote pamphlets were retired and missionaries were stopped from kind of, giving religious instruction on reservations and so on.
Mm. Yeah, that's wild. And yeah, there was the whole thing where kids were being removed from the reservations to kind of isolate them from tradition. And this is kind of a long-standing thing that empire's kind of done, right? This is not new. It's just only new in that it happened here.
Yeah, that's right. And it happened, the Spanish did the same in Mexico with peyote, the sort of Mexican Inquisition banned it, and that's kind of, there's much more explicit religious language there, that peyote's visions are given by the devil and, all that. What's interesting about reading all this stuff from the reservation era in the Wild West is most of it is in this kind of modern technocratic language. It's about public health and kind of worry about addiction and kind of all that. But you've still got these missionaries there going, no, this is about saving souls for Jesus. So you can see that the war on drugs has this kind of very Christian foundations that are normally invisible, but they're very visible at this point.
Yeah, that's great. So, yeah, I think people listening, if you're interested in this whole kind of repressed area, please do dig in. This like oppression of Indian populations is really under discussed, and we're not really taught much about it. So please do dig in, because not only is it endlessly fascinating, it's just super rich history that informs perhaps how you're going to think about Indians in the Amazon rainforest or elsewhere, or even ones in the U.S. or Canada.
I think that's right. And I think that psychedelics and peyote is a very good way of approaching this, of getting into it, getting inside that story. And also in the process, what I found great about immersing myself in it is, you realize that the way that we conceive psychedelics in modern Western culture is not the only way of thinking about it. There are other ways of approaching, these plants and these experiences. And, that's really kind of properly mind expanding once you start to immerse yourself in that.
So maybe to go further into the Native American church stuff, do you see the way folks in that world are using it is mainly for their own kind of visionary experience and relationship with spirit and spirits, plural? Or like, is there actual kind of shamanic practices happening where they're healing each other, maybe, or what's the diversity there?
No, at the meeting that I attended, there was a formal healing, as in somebody who had talked about their physical sickness beforehand was brought out of the circle by the roadman and kind of covered in incense and became the focus of everybody for that healing moment. Generally, there's a kind of an interesting thing happened between kind of Mexican or sort of South American shamanic practice and the Native American church. In kind of Mexico and South America, there's a sort of certain people are shamans and they have kind of special spiritual powers. The Native American church really sets up a very different model from that. The roadman, who's the person who is the facilitator for the ceremony, is very, very important that he doesn't kind of behave like a priest. So, for example, part of the ritual is that all the drum and the rattle and all the sacred stuff gets passed around the circle before and after so everyone can touch it, just to make that point. This is not some special thing. So it's more, I guess, influenced by the Protestant religion that was around it. Everybody is their own conscience. Everybody is their own priest. It's much more individual in that sense. And, in terms of the healing, my sense is that, the ceremony, the meeting, it does what it does and it does the same to everybody. And that if, one of the issues that you're trying to resolve is to do with your physical health, it will be healing, but if that's not the most important thing for you, it will have some other effect. So healing is not like a sort of different type of ceremony or a different type of modality. It's kind of a specific example of the kind of general thing that, works for everybody.
Yeah, that's great. I always find it interesting, the myriad, there's so many use cases for psychedelic drugs, and even when the West got a hold of it, they were trying to figure it out too. It sounds like they were doing these kind of crazy acid salons. Was it in New York City, right? Chelsea neighborhood, maybe? I forget offhand, but just really fascinating, all these use cases, from just basic scientific research to healing to different kinds of religion. It's just really, really cool.
Yeah, and not, and don't forget art. When these, the sort of very first peyote experiences in the West, a lot of people who take them, are artists or philosophers, and it doesn't immediately occur to them that this is a spiritual experience. A lot of people frame it as, wow, I'm seeing the world as I've never seen it before. This has really changed my aesthetic sense. It's kind of deepened my, appreciation of the world. And that's kind of what Huxley says in Doors of Perception, right? He says, this is how you ought to see. He says, I feel like Adam on the morning of creation. So, he's got, he's got religious and spiritual metaphors, but, there's a great sort of hidden tradition back there of people, sort of avant-garde, sort of modernist artists, who are trying to find ways of getting around the frame of normal perception and, create original work that makes you look at the world again. A lot of those people had an amazing time with peyote or mescaline. So, there's kind of the pure science of what's this doing in the mind? What does it tell me about the brain? And then there's the applied kind of medical stuff around healing. And then there's the spiritual stuff. And then there's also this artistic stuff and philosophical as well. It's people like Jean-Paul Sartre taking mescaline, he himself having a really unpleasant time of it. But yeah. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the sort of French philosopher who kind of came after him, a sort of phenomenologist, kind of writing really, really well, I think, about, what does this tell us about, our sort of visual and our sensory experience and where it comes from. This is not just something going on in our brains. We can tell the difference between an experience that's only happening to us and one that's happening to everybody. So people using psychedelics to think around philosophy in really interesting ways too.
So back to art, there, from what I recall, there's an interesting segment about Salvador Dali's school. I don't remember. Is he Dadaist? Is that the kind of phrasing they would use there?
Well, he was a surrealist.
Surrealist.
Yeah.
And wasn't it the case that he was very kind of anti people using drugs regularly?
Yeah, the sort of pope of the surrealist movement was Andre Breton, and the surrealist movement had an incredible number of rules that you'd be kind of slung out if you broke these rules. And Breton actually had quite a background in psychiatry and neurology. And he sort of felt strongly that if you were doing this crazy stuff, particularly if you were, doing kind of all this automatic drawing and writing and, trying to get in touch with the subconscious directly, this was weird stuff that could drive you crazy. And if you were on drugs, you were out. So right in the kind of core of the surrealist movement around Breton, you find a few things written later by people going, oh, yeah, the surrealists were all really into mescaline. But nobody talks about it at the time. But there were quite a lot of other kind of avant-gardists, particularly in Eastern Europe, who were much more interested in exploring this and often had, psychologists or psychiatrists who would kind of, get them some laboratory mescaline and work with them. So there's some spectacular work from that period, often done in kind of quite a sort of clinical lab setting, people just, these sort of weird artists just being summoned into a mental hospital and injected with mescaline at 10 in the morning, and, given a pen and paper.
I did love that scene too. That was great. I couldn't imagine how surreal that would be for that particular artist that you wrote about. Next level.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what kind of attention have you been getting about the book? Have you been getting kind of any praise from media outlets? I know you did a bit of a tour recently. All I know is that you got to Santa Cruz. I didn't really see what else you got to do.
I got to Santa Cruz, which was great. I got to Berkeley, that was great. I hung out with my old buddy Eric Davis in the Bay, and met up with the Aeroids and visited Shulgin's lab. That was a real thrill. So that was a great time. Yeah, generally it's you realize it's a kind of there's a core of people who are really interested in psychedelics, and there's actually a much larger area of people who are not really defined as psychedelic people, but who are interested in a lot of this culture. But then beyond that, there are so many different, it's interesting to anthropologists. It's interesting to pharmacologists, it's interesting to art historians. There's a lot of, there are so many different disciplines that it contributes to. So stuff like podcasts have been great because you can just talk to somebody who's interested in one particular bit of the book. I've had a couple of exhibitions here in London. I had one, we were just talking about these experiments with giving surrealists mescaline and seeing what they painted. Well, all that stuff has been sitting in an archive for since the 1930s, and most of it's never been shown. So wow. I did an exhibition of that over the summer, which was great. And then there's a cool gallery here in London who've been off collecting sort of Huichol art from the Western Sierra Madre and Native American stuff, and putting together a kind of exhibition around that, which I'm sort of working with them on and sort of bringing out the sort of, the peyote dimension to the work. So yeah, it's a question of kind of breaking out of the drug ghetto, and just identifying all the different people who this stuff is really interesting to.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm happy to hear that it's happening that way. And I'm really happy to hear that there's Huichol art in the UK.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's a fascinating art form. I believe it was in your book. It talked about this kind of like transition from Huichol art being more ritualistic at its origin point and being at religious sites. And then, as things developed, it became more this art form of big paintings. And I always thought that was a really fascinating move.
It's really fascinating. And also the way it changes, I looked at, because Huichol art has this quality that you look at it and you go, wow, that's trippy, and it really looks like and feels like, if you've taken psychedelics, it really feels like a representation of that state. But of course, it's all synthetically dyed threads and stuff. If you go back to the 30s and look at the first collection of it, it doesn't look like that at all. So it's kind of co-evolved in a way with our kind of Western ideas of sort of psychedelic art. But it's also, there are Huichol groups who come over here quite often to, big conferences like Breaking Convention, and I'm really impressed by the way that they, identify the interest in their culture around the world and the way that they use that. They've got this kind of millennial project of rebalancing the world, going around and doing ceremonies. And, that's not, for people who, has come from this very traditional sacred world, the way that they will like jump out and engage with the rest of us, I think it's really amazing.
It's really charitable of them, for sure. I do appreciate that. And that's really neat. Do you know if peyote and mescaline must be kind of controlled in the UK? Like there must be drug laws or
yeah. I mean, we had, because mescaline was on the scene very early on, I think it's odd that, it's like Aldous Huxley takes mescaline and then he and Humphrey Osmond come up with the word psychedelic to describe it. So that's the sense in which I call it the first psychedelic, So, but then you look at the psychedelic renaissance today and it's all LSD and psilocybin and ketamine and MDMA, and there's no kind of mescaline anywhere. It's kind of disappeared, So, and I think part of that is because it was there so early. It was legally controlled very early on. By the end of the 60s, it was same as LSD. It was Schedule 1, Class A, and then controlled under the international conventions. And that's part of the reason why I think it's disappeared. But there's always been a grey, sort of legal grey area around, particularly the San Pedro cactus. I was the expert witness for the defense in a series of prosecutions here about 10 years ago, where the customs tried to prosecute people who were buying dried San Pedro by mail order from Peru or Bolivia or whatever. And it turns out that weirdly it's supplied very widely by kind of cactus specialists, and in garden centers you can get it because it's so fast growing and it's so tolerant of such little different conditions that people started using it way back as a rooting stock, for grafting other cacti onto. And that happened and was going, before people figured out that it had mescaline in it. So it has this whole other life where it's available. So it's kind of a grey area. I think quite a lot of people grow it. It's not so hard to buy it commercially. If you are kind of like really obviously producing huge amounts of it for mescaline synthesis, you're in trouble. I don't know, how is it over there?
From what I understand, you can buy it in many stores. I know that in Phoenix, Arizona, it's everywhere. People have it in their yards all over. So it's pretty widespread. That said, people are starting to do ritual with it. Not white folks and standard American folks, doing their neo-shamanic thing, and it's interesting. I do like to see that it's happening and spreading, and it's available as something you can grow at home, which is a big deal.
I saw a lot of it in California, and I think this is probably a good point to say that San Pedro really is the sustainable environmental option for this. That peyote is under a lot of supply and demand pressure at the moment. It grows in sort of the northern deserts of Mexico and a little bit over the border in Texas. That little bit over the border in Texas, there are peyoteros who traditionally harvest it. You're not allowed to cultivate it, but you can harvest it. And they supply the chapters of the Native American Church. But in that area, there's a lot of the traditional peyote growing fields are now used for agriculture or for cattle. The supply is dwindling and the demand is growing. on the Mexican side of the border, there are just like a ton of Mexican patent medicines that you can find in markets that, like little bottles that say kind of peyote extract, with a picture of a Huichol shaman on, and who knows what's in them. But, they're digging up. There are lots of areas where peyote used to grow everywhere and doesn't anymore. So San Pedro, by contrast, grows everywhere, sort of between 2,000 and 3,000 meters, all up and down the Andes, from Ecuador all the way down to Argentina. It's very, very fast growing. It's very sustainable. The vast majority of the mescaline on this planet right now is in those San Pedro cacti. So I think that's the way to go in terms of experimental and ceremonial use.
Absolutely agree. Peyote is under such pressure that people that want to use it for their religion are having access issues.
Mm-hmm.
And people that, we should be sensitive about, these Native American folks who can't access their religion because of the demand of white folks. Perhaps we should just back off for a little while until we can figure this out in a culturally sensitive way.
Well, it'd be nice if we could find some way of permitting cultivation, because that would solve the problem.
There's a gentleman, Cody, from the River Styx Foundation. It's an interesting philanthropic organization. He's working very closely with the Navajo group to develop a cultivation scenario in Texas, and he's working with the federal government to help figure that out. And the concept is, for every peyote button harvested, they'll plant 2. And that's going to be a really cool project. I hope it works out. We did a podcast.
Yeah, there's a guy called Martin Terry, who's a botany professor down in El Paso, who's working on the same. That would be the solution, if it was not for the legal obtuseness that stopped that from happening.
Right, absolutely. So that would be really great to see that happening. And I do, as interested as I am in peyote, I'm just not really going to eat it anytime in the near future. I do know that they're growing it like crazy. I think in like Thailand or Vietnam, there's large scale production over there. And from what I understand, it's not scheduled. And I have not confirmed this, but I think peyote is not scheduled in Canada either. So there's room potentially, check with a lawyer first for greenhouse grows up there.
Mm-hmm. Right, it would not be your sort of first choice as a cash crop because it grows so slowly. Also, for what it's worth, there's you can get into very kind of geeky online forums about the difference in the experience between San Pedro and peyote and pure mescaline. And mescaline is only one of about 50 alkaloids in the peyote and also in the San Pedro. They've got different alkaloidal mixes. Some people say that the experience is subjectively different. For what it's worth, from my experience, the real difference is in kind of how you take it, whether you take it on your own or in a communal setting or experimental or ceremonial. For me, that makes a whole lot more difference to the experience than which particular cactus material you use.
Well, that's really good to hear. I was going to ask that. So for the most part, no real difference unless you're talking about context. So that's really great.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of folks that listen here kind of get into the spirit angle of it. And, I'll just say, I'd perhaps leave that spirit alone for a little while if you want to talk about it that way. Let's figure this thing out first.
They have very different, to talk in indigenous terms about personalities, I think they have very different personalities. You can just look at that. It's bizarre that mescaline only exists in nature in cacti, because it's not actually a very complex alkaloid, but it's doubly bizarre that it only exists in the San Pedro and the peyote because they're so different. The San Pedro is this kind of huge, like classic cartoon cactus, tall, columnar, spiny, vigorous. You see it up on those Andean slopes in the sun. It's just like, whoa, it's a real, like a whole kind of city of mescaline factories up there. Peyote could not be more different. It's always it hides. It's very small. The Native American thing is you have to kind of really humble yourself, get down to its little size, to really appreciate it. And so it's not a stretch to see that the two cacti have very different personalities.
Yeah, that's cool. Now, we're coming up on an hour, so we'll probably wrap in about 4 or 5 minutes. But anything we perhaps missed that would be interesting for folks to hear about?
Good question. I think one of the things that was interesting for me is there's kind of two stories here. There's the indigenous, the non-Western story, and the Western story. And to look at how they go is interesting. I mean, writing them, the Western story is full, from the very beginning of first-person experiences. So it's all mostly guys, whether scientists or artists or, those kind of sitting down. There's a lot of that kind of 8:52, take 4 peyote buttons, 9:23, start to see kind of violet patterns shimmering around my notepad. We've got it's very much centered from our point of view on, the individual experience and describing that as precisely as possible, and particularly in terms of the visions, Westerners really kind of get straight into the sort of describing the visions in a lot of detail. You kind of go back to indigenous sources, and there's very little people, there are very few kind of accounts like that of people saying, I took the peyote and I did this and I saw that, because that feels, I think, in a non-Western context, kind of a bit crude and reductive. It's not all about the drug, it's about the fact that, all the people who are going to be important to you for the rest of your life are all sitting around. It's about the context that you're doing it in. It's more of a collective experience. So, and it's interesting also, to look at there's some very nice centenary markers. So 1919, precisely 100 years ago, was mescaline first synthesized in a lab. And over that last 100 years, it's had this incredible rise and fall, being used in science and art and sort of different spiritual contexts. And then kind of after Huxley becoming super famous and now kind of pretty much vanishing, you look at that same period with the Native American church, 100 years of, trials and tribulations and intense legal persecution. But basically, they've been doing the same thing throughout. And it's really thriving, more members now than ever. So it's kind of interesting that as we go forward into the future, it's the cactus and not the chemical, that's really kind of the form in which everyone's getting to know it.
Yeah, that's huge. Are you aware of any kind of historical kind of nefarious use by government or various other groups back then? We were doing the Manchurian Project, MK Ultra, all that. Like, did mescaline play a part?
It did, because it was the only, psychedelic drug at that time. And the people who were doing that, which included the Nazis and MK Ultra, and a lot of the same people in both, MK Ultra kind of came in.
Pretty good. Yeah, we stole a bunch of the scientists and let them continue, which is creepy, but okay.
And a lot of those experiments they were kind of trying everything, to try and, brainwash people or sort of break people's minds down or whatever. And a lot of those experiments kind of started with mescaline, but kind of then they moved on pretty quickly because they found that, it didn't necessarily make people talk more, and it didn't kind of make them say things that they wouldn't otherwise have said. There's kind of a great bit in one of the early reports, because it sort of has different effects on different people, and they record that. And there's this great bit at the end that says, the only thing that was, witnessed in all subjects was a marked hostility towards the experimenters.
Right. Yeah. Like, okay, set and setting here. It's just going to make you angry and blow you up a little bit. This is there's this movie, really kind of dumb movie, Pineapple Express, American kind of pot movie, and the opening scene is that guy smoking this super pot, and then he starts yelling, and he's an army enlisted officer, just starts yelling at the experimenters, which is to me kind of funny. I thought about that in relation to MK Ultra a little bit too.
Exactly that. So all those kind of weird, sinister mind control things, they kind of move on from mescaline to cannabis, and they kind of usually end up with, those things like, sodium amytal and those kind of like heavy sort of hypnotic sedatives. But even those, I've just been reading this new biography of Sidney Gottlieb, who was the sort of head around the FK Ultra project. It's so bizarre, but what comes across is that they were just totally convinced that the Russians and the Chinese had this technology. They'd cracked it. They could do brainwashing. Mind control was real. So from that assumption, they just kept getting back negative results after negative results, however hard they pushed it. And they never questioned that actually maybe this just isn't the thing.
Right. Yeah. Perhaps this class of drugs isn't really going to do it. It's going to be something else.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. I do love the topic because it's so kind of just endlessly interesting. And you really wonder about, like, what's still classified and what did work, what didn't work. But I don't think we'll know what worked for another 30 years, probably.
No, I think it's probably the safest assumption is that nothing worked. That kind of that explains the whole thing better than anything else.
Right, absolutely. Cool. Yeah, kidnapping and blackmail is easy enough. I don't really know why you need exotic drugs to really do much more.
Yeah, exactly. It's not as if humanity, through its history, has not kind of worked through the usual repertoires of ways of getting compliance out of people.
Yeah, endless. All right, cool. So we're at about an hour. Perhaps you can tell us how people can find your book and where they can find your website to keep on top of what you're up to.
Sure. The book should be out there. It's published by Yale University Press in hardback. There's also an audio book. So those are both available from bookshops or your online suppliers or whatever. And I have a website, which is mikej.net, where I've got a page on the book and round up links to podcasts and stuff like that. And I'm on Twitter too, at mikej.net. You'll find me there as well. Not tweeting kind of incredibly large amounts, but just trying to keep people up to date.
Yeah, and that's where I found you and was able to reach out, and before I even Googled you to find your website. So,
yeah.
Thank you, Mike J, for joining us on the show. It's been really fun. And,
real pleasure.
Hope we can check in again in the future.
Great.
Thank you all for tuning in. This was a super fun episode for me. I hope you liked this. I hope you buy the book or press your library to get it, which would probably be even better because more people would read it. I'm really impressed with the work Mike J did on this, and I hope to see more books from Mike J at this level of authorship. Super great book, and I hope you buy it. Again, you can scoop it up for free on Audible, audibletrial.com/psychedelics today. You get a 30-day free trial and a free copy of the book that you keep even if you cancel your trial. So check that out. I love Audible. There's books by Terrence McKenna, Rick Strassman, Graham Hancock, all the psychedelic legends. Even Jim Fadiman has the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide up there. I believe there's 1 or 2 Stan Groff books on there as well. Check it out. It really helps us out if you get a trial. So again, audibletrial.com/psychedelics today. Other way to help us out is to join us for our upcoming Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. It is going to be a phenomenal course and will really up your game and keep you ahead of the pack on this psychedelic rush that's happening. Everybody's really stoked on the subject. Clinicians are flocking to it. Some people, you might even see people panicking. Like, I'm going to be out of a job, or I'm not going to be up to speed. Don't panic. You've got plenty of time. But there are people doing this work now with cannabis, ketamine, and many other things legally in the United States and elsewhere. So if you take a global perspective, there are a lot of interesting legal avenues to do this work. But how do you get educated? The MAPS protocol is really locked down because they are really working hard to get as many people trained that will be doing MDMA-assisted therapy at approved sites. So they need to gear up a ton of people, and it's really hard to get into their program because you need to be attached to a group that's doing the therapeutic work, or plans to once expanded access happens and final FDA approval happens. So they've got to gear up a ton of people, and unless you're attached, it's really hard to get in. So The other option is CIIS. That's a great school, a great program, perhaps a bit expensive because you have to go to San Francisco 6 times in 6 months. Not only go there, but stay there and eat there. And you've also got to pay tuition, which is, not cheap. So this is a bit cheaper. You get 8 weeks with us, and you get a ton of pre-recorded content and masterclasses, and we have 8 hour-and-a-half online sessions in which we get to discuss the course content. And it's going to be amazing. We've got a European-friendly time and a U.S. East Coast-friendly time, 7 p.m. East Coast time, and I think 7 p.m. London time. So if those times work for you, check it out. If you want to learn more, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. We'd love to have you join us. We think it's an amazing course. We've been getting amazing feedback from folks. So check it out, psychedeliceducationcenter.com, and it's navigating psychedelics for clinicians and therapists. And again, the nicest thing you can do for us is tell a friend about our show. If you like it, if it helps you, tell a friend. We would really appreciate it. And financially, if you want to help us out, patreon.com/psychedelics. You can leave a small monthly donation, and that really helps us out a ton. You get perks and pre-recorded content that might not hit the airwaves for a month or two. So if you want to help us out, get some other perks, check us out, patreon.com/psychedelics today. I think that's it for this episode. Thank you all for tuning in to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore signing off from Breckenridge, Colorado. See you on the next episode.